So good morning, everybody. Appreciate you taking the time to jump on here this morning. This next hour is another action-packed hour of agronomy topics. So last week we talked about fungicide mode of action. This week we're moving on. We'll split up the time. The first half we'll talk about insecticides. Second half we'll talk about seed treatments. And then just so you're aware of the schedule the next few weeks. Next week we're actually not going to hold a call. So I'll need to send the cancellation notice out for next week. But then after that, in the month of December, on the 7th, the 14th, and the 21st, we'll discuss spray application and go in depth on different adjuvant types and uses for adjuvants. Okay, so that's kind of the schedule for the next month or so. But like I said, today we'll be discussing insecticides for the first part, and then seed treatments. Okay, so to jump in here, wanted to touch on different classes of insecticides. And to start off with, I will mention this is very basic. Talking about these different insecticide classes. We're going to start basic and talk about different ways to classify them, different modes of action or chemical makeup, things like that, and give different examples of products that you're most likely working with in these different categories. Okay, but as far as the different classes of insecticides, we can classify them in a number of different ways, anything from mode of action to mode of entry. So mode of action is kind of talking about how exactly the insecticide is going to kill the pest. Mode of entry is, how is it getting into the insect? Is it a stomach poison? Is it a contact, systemic? Is it a fumigant? Things like that. And then the last portion there, chemical makeup of the insecticide. There's different categories within that, whether it be an oil, a botanical, or synthetics. And I will mention that, the majority of our insecticides that we use in production ag would fall under synthetic. And we'll talk about that a little more in depth as we move along. Okay. As far as different modes of action, here's, a very simplified version, I'm sure. That's actually kind of a joke, but so we have this committee here, the Insecticide Resistance Action Committee, and they've put together, this is actually a one-pager, kind of a little poster where they put all the different there's 29 so far, 25 or 29 different modes of action of insecticides on the market. Okay. This information I will mention is in the crop protection guide. Page 757 has this in a table form that might be a little bit easier to digest than all these graphics. But it just goes to show that there's many, many different modes of action on the market. Okay. For production ag, we narrow that down. There's only a few key modes of action that we tend to focus on, and we'll talk about those more in depth as we go along. Okay. There's different mode of action subgroups, whether they be a neuromuscular poison, so those would be attacking the nervous system. There's respiratory poisons that inhibit energy metabolism, gut disruptors, things like Bt proteins would fall under a gut disruptor, and then there's insect growth regulators as well. I guess before we move on from mode of action, I did want to throw in something here related to insecticide resistance. This is something that has come up over the last 5-6 years, in that there were different counties in southern Minnesota, northern Iowa, where they were suspecting pyrethroid-resistant aphids, soybean aphids. And so, part of the question is, how are they able to do that? And so there's a few different ways that insecticide resistance, there's these different mechanisms. And so the first one to touch on that's probably the most common is metabolic resistance. And so there's different enzymes that are active within the insect, and what they're doing is they pretty much metabolize, or they break down that specific molecule, the insecticide molecule, so that it doesn't fit in the actives or the site of action in the target protein. Okay, and so if it doesn't fit there, it can't bind to the target protein and shut off that process within the insect. And so that's kind of the basics of metabolism-based resistance. There's also target site resistance, where instead of metabolizing the insecticide, what the insect is doing is changing the binding site at the protein. Okay, and so if we've changed that, exactly how that target area looks, or how it's made up at the protein, then the insecticide can't bind to that area. Okay, so two common ways that we develop insecticide resistance, so either metabolism based or target site. There's a couple others. One is behavioral based, where the insects evolve over time, and then they can detect a toxin and kind of stay away from it. And then the other one is penetration resistance. And with that, if the insecticide if it's intended that the insect would absorb it, they develop this mechanism where they absorb it more slowly. Okay, and so the insecticide doesn't kill them. Okay, so those are some things to keep in mind there with mode of action. The next way to categorize different insecticides is mode of entry. And so this would be stomach poisons. That's a very common one. So the killing action has to be in the digestive system. There's also contact poisons. If they just come in contact with it, it absorbs it through the body wall of the insect. So a lot of our insecticides that we use in production ag have a combination of stomach action as well as being a contact poison. There's also different fumigants on the market. A lot of these are used in vegetable production, things like that. Potatoes, for example, they fumigate the soil to kill the nematodes in the soil before planting potatoes. There's systemic poisons as well. One example of this would be like our Neonics that we use as seed treatments on soybeans. They have very good systemic action within the plant, and so that's a mode of entry as well. But like I said before, a lot of our insecticides that we use are a combination of a stomach poison and they have contact properties as well. Okay, last thing that we'll talk about as far as ways to classify them, chemical makeup, and there's actually three categories under this. So chemical makeup, the first one is oils. This is pretty common in orchards or ornamentals, so in trees. And this would be things like your dormant oil that you could apply to inhibit the insects before they emerge. So things like your dormant oil. With these, you have to use a high spray volume. They're relatively inexpensive, low mammalian toxicity, so that's a plus for these. But like I said, most of these are used in trees, and they're used kind of to suffocate those insects before they develop. Okay, so oils. The next one is botanicals. You'll see some examples under here as being nicotine and pyrethrum. And so these are kind of the natural version of our synthetics that we use on the market today. So like our Neonics are developed from a nicotine, and then the pyrethrum, our pyrethroids are developed from pyrethrum. And so the synthetics that we use today were the base version of those are in botanicals. Okay, these are plant-derived chemicals, relatively expensive when they're in this botanical form. A lot of these, might be for the homeowner, things like that. They're not widely used in production ag. Okay, although originally they were. Okay, so the last one, and this will be our focus for the rest of the insecticide portion, are synthetics. Okay, so a lot of these were developed in the 1950s through the 1970s. So after World War II, these are relatively inexpensive. Good thing about these is, for the most part, they're broad spectrum. So they do a very good job of controlling a number of different insects that we deal with. And then there's several chemical families under this. So the different families under this, under synthetics, first one, chlorinated hydrocarbons. We don't use a whole lot of these anymore. These were very persistent. They have a very long half-life, so a long residual. They persist in the environment. One to mention here would be DDT, that originally, when it was developed, it was kind of a miracle insecticide, and it really helped in areas of the world where they were dealing with malaria. And so they could do a very good job of controlling mosquitoes with the DDT. The problem was it persisted in the environment, and it affected birds and other animals. And so we don't really use chlorinated hydrocarbons anymore. There's also organophosphates, organosulfurs, carbamates, which are kind of a cousin to organophosphates, pyrethroids, and neonics. And I've bolded the three that we're going to focus on. Okay, so the first one is organophosphate. So like I said before, these were developed in the 50s through the 70s. Some of the common products that you might have heard of: malathion, lorsban, or Yuma, counter, dimethoate or dimate would fall under this category as well. So a lot of you have probably been working through, hey, what are our options since the announcement from the EPA, which came out back in August, where they said 6 months from the release of their statement that we wouldn't be able to use chlorpyrifos containing products anymore. And so pretty much after February of 2022, we can't use products that contain chlorpyrifos. And so hopefully you've been working through different options for that. And I guess if you have questions on that, you can contact your local Winfield United rep. You could visit with Tyler. You could visit with me about it. There's a number of different options available. Okay. As the name implies, this category is developed from phosphoric acid. They're generally more toxic to vertebrates than chlorinated hydrocarbons. They tend to break down quickly in the environment, which is a good thing for other mammals aside from insects. Okay, this is the largest group of insecticides, but one thing to mention is there's not really any new products being developed under this organophosphate category. A lot of these have, like I said before, stomach as well as contact activity on insects. Okay. Different products under this, lorsban and Yuma. Of course, premixes. Winfield United has Tundra Supreme, and then there's Cobalt Advanced, which also has that as well. Some of the other ones, malathion would fall under this category. Counter would fall under it as well. And like I said before, these chlorpyrifos containing products, we're not going to be able to use those moving forward. Okay, so what exactly are organophosphates doing? This is probably getting a little too detailed for some people. Some of you might be interested in this. We'll probably not spend a whole lot of time on it. With this, it's showing, you know, exactly what organophosphates are doing. So we've got the junction of two nerve cells. It's called a synapse, right? And so to get muscles to move, we have to have this transmission of a nervous signal from one cell to the next across the synapse. And so we've got, the way we do that is with acetylcholine. It helps to transport that nervous signal. And of course, in the next cell in the chain, there's an acetylcholine receptor. And so that's how we get the nervous signal to transfer. The way we stop that is acetylcholine esterase. It helps to break down acetylcholine, and that's what this is showing here. The stars represent that enzyme, acetylcholine esterase, and it's breaking down the acetylcholine to stop the signal. And so that helps to stop the muscle from firing. Now, where organophosphates come in is they disrupt the activity of acetylcholine esterase. And so we end up with an overtransmission of the signal, and you end up with tremors and twitching, things like that. So I think that's generally what we see out in the field, is if you see the insects that are twitching there, that's a result of an overstimulation or an overtransmission of that signal. Okay. One thing to be aware of with organophosphates is, the application of different herbicides. We've got different ALS inhibitors, some HPPD inhibitors, mesotrione listed under here, where we want to be careful. And a lot of these labels do call out this watch out, where, if we've applied one of these organophosphates, we want to be careful as far as applying some of these products afterwards, or the timing of it after we've applied that organophosphate. The reason being is they're broken down in the same pathway within the plant, and we could end up with increased activity, like in this case with Callisto. If we were to apply some of these organophosphate soil applied insecticides, we could see increased activity out of the Callisto, so increased yellow flash after those applications. Okay, this is in the crop protection guide as well, in that corn section. I just wanted to call that out briefly. Adjuvant recommendations for organophosphates. Our general recommendation across the board for insecticides is master lock, so a dripped and deposition aid with a specialized surfactant, 4 fluid ounces by air, and 6.4 fluid ounces if it's a ground-based application. Okay, so moving on to pyrethroids. So these were developed from the 1970s to the present. Some of the common products that you know of on the market are listed there. And I've got another slide here down the road a little bit that separates these out a little bit more. So like I said, these were originally, the pyrethrums or the botanicals would be very similar to this. The pyrethrins or the pyrethroids are kind of a synthetic version mimicking what's going on with those botanicals. Okay, there's been multiple generations of pyrethroids where they've gotten better activity and more effective. In general, they're very low use rates. If you compare the use rate of a pyrethroid versus an organophosphate, we're talking about ounces as compared to pints or quarts. Okay. Low mammalian toxicity, highly toxic to fish, some things to be aware of there as well. As far as what's going on with this, it's a similar type of thing with pyrethroids, the transmission of that nervous or that signal from one cell to the next. But this gets at the cell membrane level, where we've got these sodium channels that open and close to transmit the signal. And what pyrethroids are doing is they're basically getting stuck in that gate or that channel. And so we've got an over influx of sodium, and as well as the transmission of that nervous signal. And so similar results if you're seeing it out in the field. You've got these tremors, convulsions from the insect. Okay. I mentioned before, there's different generations of pyrethroids. Up here at the top, these are your natural compounds, and then one of the first generations of pyrethroids, and then some of the common products that we use today are listed down here at the bottom. Okay. Different trade names: Grizzly 2, Warrior 2. These are Lambda Psi products on the market. The premixes would be Cobalt Advanced, Indigo ZC. Some of these other ones, Arctic. Bifenthrin is probably the most widely used and very effective mode of action that falls under pyrethroids. Some of them that have it in the premix or Tundra Supreme, but like I said before, that also has chlorpyrifos, so this one we won't be able to use moving forward. Hero would be a good option. That's from FMC, which has the zeta cypermethrin as well as bifenthrin. Another one that's coming to market from Corteva would be Ridgeback. With that one, so it's a combination of bifenthrin as well as sulfoxaflor. So they call it their isoclass technology, and so it's broad spectrum. A lot of the marketing you may have seen on social media, where they talk about it as being targeted to the soybean acre, but if you look at the label, it's also labeled for corn application as well. And so it's labeled for a lot of our common insects that we run into in Iowa. But you can kind of look through the list there for some of the other products on the market as well. Pyrethroids, same adjuvant recommendation. Master Lock is a drift and deposition aid. Neonics. So a lot of these are seed treatments. There are some soil or foliar products that contain neonics as well. These are a derivative of nicotine, the botanical version. These are systemic, and they do a very good job controlling sucking insects. I'll show you a picture of that here in a couple slides. Some of the common products that you might be aware of. So imidacloprid or gaucho seed treatment is a neonic. Others here would be Cruiser or thiamethoxam, which is in Warden CX, or the Cruiser Max products from Syngenta. And then Poncho or clothianidin. Probably butchered that name, but oh well. Okay, so Poncho falls under this category as well. These have systemic and contact activity, slightly different binding site, which I'll show you here. So similar to the organophosphates, where you've got the transmission of this nervous signal from one cell to the next to control muscle movement within the insect. The neonics, they bind to these receptors, okay? And so they block the transmission of that nervous signal, so it can't be transferred from one cell to the next. And so instead of twitching and things like that, it ends with paralysis of the insect. Okay, so a little bit different activity on the insect. Some of the trade name products, Belay, Advise 4, Indigo ZC, they all contain these neonics. For foliar applications, if they do contain neonics, they're generally just approved for application to soybeans, not to corn. A premix with neonic would be Leverage 360. Same adjuvant recommendation for a foliar application, and that's Master Lock as the drift and deposition aid. So I threw this in here. This is from our seed treatment demo from a couple of years ago, Fort Dodge answer plot 2018. This could have easily been from a number of different answer plots across the state that year. We had heavy bean leaf beetle pressure early on in the season. And so these were 4-row plots, and it was to the row, the feeding, okay? So the first plot was untreated. You can see the shot holes for the feeding through those plants looking pretty ragged. Next one, we had Warden RTA with Vibrance and Ilevo. So this is only a fungicide in here, no insecticide, and similar type of story. If we look closely there, those are looking pretty ragged because of the feeding from bean leaf beetle. And then the one on the right here, this is Warden CX. So it has the same fungicide as this middle treatment, but it also has the Cruiser or the thiamethoxam insecticide in there with it. And so it really was to the row. The feeding stopped on the Warden CX treatment. Those plants were getting off to a better start and didn't really have any feeding from the bean leaf beetles. Okay, so the neonics are very effective. In some areas, there is concern as far as it affecting bees. And in some areas of the world, Canada, for example, there are regulations around the use of neonics. So there are different companies, Corteva being one, that's developing different options that are non-neonic seed treatments. Okay, the last one that I'll touch on here, then I'll just highlight a couple of pieces of reference material. So group 11, so BT. So this is I threw this in here because a lot of our corn products have a BT trait in them, and the general idea with this is the corn produces these proteins. They're crystal-like proteins, so that's why a lot of times you'll hear them referred to as the cry proteins, because they're a crystal protein that gets stuck in the midgut of the caterpillar and or the worm, and it tears up the midgut and eventually kills that insect. Okay, and so this is another category commonly used. A lot of times we don't think of applying this as an insecticide, but it's just included in those BT corn products. Does a very good job of protecting those plants. This is from our corn rootworm demo a couple of years ago. We could have had pictures from our demo last year. It would look very similar to this, where we had just a Roundup Ready hybrid, but we applied a soil applied insecticide on it. And you can see the goosenecking, the feeding on those roots, and reduced overall root mass compared to the product that had the Herculex trait, so Smart Stacks hybrid on the right. You can see the stalks are nice and straight, had good standability, and very good root development and root protection from that trait. Okay, one thing I will mention in the crop protection guide, we do have this reference material there. We didn't really talk about carbamates. They're very similar to organophosphates, but generally they're a little bit slower acting and have less residual than our organophosphates. But this kind of lays it out, you know, everywhere it's green is it's controlling that particular insect. Of course, next we have organophosphates, the chlorpyrifos ones, as I mentioned before, some of those are going away, or we won't be able to use the chlorpyrifos containing products moving forward, I should say. Of course, pyrethroids. Some of these other ones down here aren't as widely used. And one thing I did want to mention, some of the products like Oberon from Bayer or Agromec from Syngenta, they're very effective. They're not considered broad spectrum. They're very effective on spider mites in particular. And so, you know, moving forward, that might be an option if you're very concerned or have a huge issue with spider mites. Some of these very focused products might be an option to consider. Okay, and then the last one that I'll mention here, the tank mixes, and you can see just how good the tank mixes are. A lot more green for all the tank mixes because they do a very good job of controlling those different insects. That's for corn. It's also in the crop protection guide for soybeans, wheat, alfalfa. There is some reference material. This is on page 80 in the crop protection guide. You might have seen the handy BT trait table online. This is very similar information, probably a little bit more detailed than that trait table. But this gives you an idea for, you know, a particular hybrid based on what the brand name is, what the genes it has in it, any kind of particular traits, what insects it's either supposed to control or suppress, if you need to include a separate refuge or what the refuge in the bag portion is, and things like that. So this reference material is in the crop protection guide. As far as insecticide performance, yeah.
Before we go on, I got a question sent in to me on the new Smart Stacks Pro and how that differs from the current BT proteins.
Yeah, so Smart Stacks Pro, it'll still have that. It'll be paired up with the BT proteins, but it has its RNAi technology. And so it's basically changing how the plant is able to, or how the insect, it inhibits the insect's ability to produce a key protein in its midgut. Okay, so rather than the plant or the insect just relying on or just ingesting the cry protein and it tearing up the midgut. This is a whole separate mode of action. So it'll inhibit the production of an essential protein within that insect. So kind of neat, a little bit different technology. As far as some considerations around insecticide performance, timing of the applications. I know a lot of times for convenience, we might include an insecticide in with a fungicide application, for example. But really, our best agronomic recommendation would be to monitor insect pressure out in the field. And if we've hit threshold for a particular insect, to go ahead and apply an insecticide at that point. And that really protects us from developing increased resistance to specific insecticides. Another thing to be aware of, spray water pH can impact the performance of insecticides, organophosphates. There's certain insecticides that break down in high pH water. So that's something to be aware of. And then solubility. We'll see less solubility if we have dry soil conditions. And then the last thing I have is we do have a reference sheet, a one-page reference sheet. This is the old one. We've got an updated one for this year that a lot of the commonly used products lists out the different active ingredients, use rates, and pre-harvest intervals for those products. So those are some of the key things that I wanted to cover. We'll send out these slides after the call. I'll send out this reference sheet after the call as well. And we'll turn it over to Tyler to continue on with seed treatments.
All right, sounds good. You know, one other thing as I'm transitioning here, one other thing that I'll share with you on insecticides, because I always get the question, golly, these darn insecticides, they have a varied use rate from, you know, it could be as low as 1 ounce up to 7 ounces. What the heck do I use? Guys, some of these, when you go through and you read the label or you look in the crop protection guide, it will give you a specific rate range by the individual insect that you're going after. And so that might be your best option, is to look in the crop protection guide and identify the insect that you're going up against and figure out what the rate range is for there. And then after that, if you're looking at still a pretty wide range, because some of them still have a fairly wide range there, then you almost have to look at the severity of the infection, the severity of the amount of insects that are there. The size of insect makes a big difference. For example, one of the things that we fought a lot of this fall was fall armyworm, right? And if you were looking at total devastation, I was telling people to go on the very high end of the use rate, because of the fact that it's going to be very hard to kill those larger insects. So the size of insect matters, the type of insect matters. Another thing that really makes a big difference is how long a residual control you want out of that, especially when we start looking at the pyrethroids, because the pyrethroids have a very wide range of applications. And generally, the longer that, or the higher the rate, the longer that it lasts. Now, that's not always the case. Generally, it works better for piercing, sucking insects than it does for chewing insects. But in general, the higher the rate, the longer the residual. So just some comments there on some insecticides. Going into seed treatments now, the reason we do seed treatments last is because a lot of these modes of action are actually the same for our fungicides and insecticides. They just now put it into a seed treatment and treat it as a new product, basically. The biggest thing I tell you guys, seed treatments is one of those things that is constantly changing, constantly moving, okay? And in fact, I got this quote, I think from Cliff Watson: the only constant in seed treatment inoculant business is change. Okay, and this can be very challenging, mainly because a lot of these products, you know, you think of like insecticide, they label a Tundra, for example, and you always know what you're getting with Tundra. Okay, you're getting bifenthrin, you're getting this amount of bifenthrin. Okay, that nothing changes there. Seed treatments are often different because a lot of these seed treatments are actually just packages. Okay. And I know this sounds confusing, but basically what it means is you could have, for example, an Acceleron 1 year mean that it has Methanoxin, it has this, just all sorts of different ones in there. And then the next year you come back, you buy the exact same Acceleron and it's a different product. It's got different active ingredients. Maybe they switched to Methanoxin, or they switched out for fludeoxonil or something like that. Okay, and so that's what makes the seed treatment business very challenging. And this is where sometimes our farmers get very confused, and it becomes very hard for them to see the value of a seed treatment, because basically what they're looking for oftentimes is just a shiny seed coat until they have issues, right? Then they come back and they're all upset, and it becomes very challenging to necessarily sell in the seed treatment world. So what I'm going to challenge you guys to do is to truly identify what are in these seed treatments and help farmers understand the benefits and the some of the drawbacks that certain ones of these seed treatments have. Okay, and I'm sure you guys have seen this, certain seed companies on the soybean side of things are just throwing a seed treatment in with the beans. Okay, they don't tell you what's in it. They don't do any of that. They just, hey, we got a seed treatment. It's got, for example, Olivo on it. Okay, well, when you go and you look at Olivo has quite a bit of a rate range to it. And in order to get, for example, SDS control, you got to be at the high end of the rate range to get good SDS control. Okay, well, a lot of these seed companies are putting a half rate of that Olivo out, which is still a labeled rate, by the way. It's still, you can claim that you have Olivo on it, but it's not going to be effective against SDS. So a lot of these companies are playing games like this. And so the thing I'll challenge you, because you'll come up against this all the time. Oh, well, I'm getting Pioneer Premium Seed Treatment for this. Oh, well, which Pioneer Premium Seed Treatment are you getting? What's in it? I don't know, right? You got to go back and you got to do the research to figure out, okay, Pioneer Premiums, and I shouldn't be, Pioneer Premium Seed Treatment actually right now is a very good product. I can't complain about it. It actually works very, very well. However, if that dealer still has some of the older iterations of Pioneer Premium Seed Treatments, there definitely was some stuff lacking out of that. Okay, and so it's important to go back and figure out what is actually in the product, because a lot of times agronomists and salespeople will play games with this because they know that farmer very rarely checks to see what is actually in the product. Okay, so usually with an insecticide, it's both usually with a seed treatment, it's both an insecticide and fungicide, although you are starting to see more just fungicide only. And that's part of the reason why I think we've been seeing more of a resurgence in some of like the bean leaf beetles and some of those types of insects. But the major insecticide classification that you get with seed treatments is going to be the neonicotinoids. And the reason why we see so many of these group 4As is because they're very, very effective. First of all, they have a long residual, and most importantly, they move in the plant. Okay, and because they move in the plant, they are a very effective seed treatment. Okay, so there's three main active ingredients that we deal with: clethianidin, imidacloprid, and thiamethoxam. Okay, and all of them are very effective insecticides. I will tell you that just looking at thiamethoxam, though, because we use thiamethoxam in our Warden CX, and it was really interesting walking some of those plots this year. Okay, we had Warden RTA and Warden CX out in our answer plots. Okay, so the only, well, there's a little bit of difference in the fungicide package there. You got half the rate of Methanoxin, but the really important difference there between Warden RTA and Warden CX is the insecticide package that's in there. Okay, it's that thiamethoxam. Thiamethoxam does have a little plant vigor effect to it. And it does get your beans, it does seem to increase the amount of beans that you have and increase the overall look of those beans out in the field. Okay, now overall, did it make a lot of difference in the yield potential of those beans? It's hard to say because we can't separate out necessarily the insecticide response versus the fungicide response, but I will tell you that those beans did look significantly better. Okay, and this is a picture that we took a while back showing very similar results to what Darren was showing there with that thiamethoxam. Okay, you can see some of the ratings that each one of these. Now, I will tell you that we're going to focus a little bit more on soybean seed treatments because there's a lot more variability and we have a lot more control over the soybean seed treatments, but I will throw some stuff in there on corn. You can see all of the different lists and what they are good, fair, and poor on. Any more, guys, with seed corn in particular, if you have a farmer that uses heavy rates of a manure, you need to make sure that you have the higher rate of a insecticide on there. So for example, going up to the Poncho 1250 for especially cattle producers, okay? Because anytime you have heavy amounts of manure, we tend to have more things like seed corn maggot, and in particular, we have a lot of wireworm. And I can remember going on a complaint call, and actually the farmer was claiming that on this complaint call, the farmer was claiming that the anhydrous was actually burning his corn. Okay, and we went out and we looked at it, and it was weird because it was just kind of scattered plants here and there. I said, well, I can't really find a pattern here. So we started digging up the plants, and we started looking, and the roots looked just fine. There was nothing wrong with it. Well, then we looked at the growing point, and we actually found a wireworm chewing right through the growing point of the corn. Okay, very heavy cattle manure every year led to an increase in wireworm. So if you have those type of farmers that are doing that, have heavy rates of manure, even so much or somewhat true of swine manure, but more of cattle manure, I would recommend going to this Poncho 1250. I have some farmers that think this works on rootworm. I'm not going to claim any control on corn rootworm. Okay, it's rated as good. Okay, you can see that here, but I'm not going to claim it as being real good on corn rootworm. Okay, it's more for your secondary pest. As far as fungicides, one of the most common categories of fungicides and one of the most unique because of the fact that you don't see this particular fungicide class being used foliarly. As for why, I actually don't know. I have no idea why. Don't know if it's just not effective. Why not? I'm sure somebody does. Somebody will probably send me an email and tell me, but I'm not sure why this is only used in seed treatments, but it is true. Okay, so we have Methanoxin and Methanoxin. Now, these look like two separate products, but really Methanoxin and Methanoxin have the exact same active ingredient. The difference is that Methanoxin is a more refined version of Methanoxin. Okay, if you go back to your chemistry class, which I know every time I say that, people in the audience just tune me out right now, but stick with me here. If we go back to our chemistry class, you may remember learning about something called isomers. Okay, basically isomers have the exact same chemical formula, but their active groups are on slightly different binding sites. Okay, and what that means, if you think of like a glove, a pair of gloves. Okay, you have a left-handed glove and a right-handed glove. Okay, let's say your insect or the thing you want to kill is your right hand. I can very easily fit my right-handed glove on there, right? But if I take my left-handed glove and try to fit it on there, it's not going to work. And that's the same kind of concept with an inactive isomer versus an active isomer. Only the active isomer will actually provide any fungicidal activity. And so when you look at metalaxyl is a combination of these inactive isomers and the active isomers. With methanoxin, they remove the inactive isomers, and so you only have the active isomers. Okay, it makes it much easier to work with. First of all, you can use a much lower rate. Basically, a half rate is equal to a full rate of metalaxyl. Okay, so the methanoxin is quite a bit better off than the metalaxyl is on control at the rates at equal rates. Okay. Now, I might have answered my own question here because our group 4 RNase, it is a narrow spectrum systemic insecticide. It only works on the Oomycetes class of fungicides, so Pythiums, Phytophthora, downy mildews, those type of things, which might be part of the reason why we don't see it foliar, because Oomycete class in general does not generally affect foliar infections there. Okay, but these are where it's going to be the most effective, is going to be against some of those water molds, is what we call them. Okay, Pythium, Phytophthora, downy mildew are all very, very, they need water to replicate and grow. So if you think about cool, wet conditions for Pythium, warm, wet conditions for Phytophthora, and cool and wet for downy mildew. Okay, now when you look at activity of these, you can see that the methanoxin at the lower rate will equal what the metalaxyl rates will. And as we increase our rates of the methanoxin, metalaxyl, we do get better and better control out of these fungicides. So if you look at Apron XL, the methanoxin versus the metalaxyl here, we got to have quite a bit more rate of that metalaxyl get similar control. Okay. One of the things that does set the Warden CX above some of these other seed treatments is we have the highest labeled rate of methanoxin in the formulation that we can have, which provides us 40 plus days of activity. Now, the reason this is so important is it helps us get a lot better control of Phytophthora, which tends to infect a little bit later than some of these other diseases. Methanoxin is also much easier to work with, and it does provide us with a lot better control at that higher rate. Okay, so here's our rate of these various active ingredients here. And you can see that with that Warden CX, we are getting about 40 days of protection. Now, Warden RTA is very similar to Warden CX. The difference is it's got half the methanoxin rate that the Warden CX had. And it does make a difference when it comes to the actual activity of this chemistry here. Ideally, this video would be playing. Not sure if it's going to. Oh, well, that's not good. Well, let's see. We'll get this back up.
I don't think your computer likes playing videos there.
No, it really doesn't. I'm not sure because it did this on what day was that? Friday? It did that on Friday.
Yeah. I've got the slide deck. Do you want me to pull it up?
I think we're good. There we go.
Okay, yep.
Thanks though. Oh, I'm not sure what's happening, Darren, because every time I go, and that's not even a big video. That's what's weird is it's like a 30-second video, so it shouldn't cause that problem. But you know what? It keeps me on my toes, keeps me going. So, all right. So basically, with those group 4s, then we do get much better control. Here's just a video from the end of that. Or a picture from the end of the video, because I did anticipate possibly having some issues. Now this is with Rhizoctonia, and you can see that when we inoculated the soil, only the Warden CX was the ones that came out of the ground versus the untreated soybeans. You didn't get any control. Now, if you had sterilized soil, both of them came out fine, right? Because you wouldn't expect to see any differences there. But when you have the inoculated soil, that's where we saw the differences. Okay. Other ones, SDHI inhibitors, these are becoming more common. So one of the first ones to come to market was Vibrance, which would be Sedexane. You'll find this in Warden CX, Cruiser Max, Chloriva Elite, and all of the new stuff from Syngenta pretty much has Sedexane in it. Very, very good Rhizoctonia control. Okay, which if you think of Rhizoctonia, basically you're going to look at the drier, warmer conditions is where we see that. This Vibrance is very good on that. Okay, you got some other ones in here, Flupyrum, and then this is the same one that I struggled with the other day, Pitiflutamethylene. Yeah, sure. Saltro. Both of these are very effective on the sudden death syndrome. Okay, you'll also notice that they're very similar to the fungicide that we talked about last week. So Flupyrum, for example, is being used in Delaro Complete, whereas this one, the Saltro active ingredient, is being used in Miravis Neo. Okay, so a lot of them are being used in multiple locations. Both are very effective against SDS. Alivo does have a little bit of baggage there with some of the plant crop response, for lack of a better term. Guys, realistically, crop response at that time doesn't make a lot of difference unless you're killing your overall stand. Okay, but we do have farmers that are sensitive to that. And so in that case, Saltro would be a good option. The only thing I haven't seen a lot of data on yet is, so Saltro also, or sorry, Alivo also claims activity on SCN, soybean cyst nematode, and happens to be fairly good on soybean cyst nematode. I'm not sure where Saltro falls on that necessarily. Okay, but definitely the Alivo, if you have SCN, is probably going to be the way to go until we figure out on the Saltro side whether we have really good activity on the SCN as well. Okay, very similar to what we talked about last week, binds to that ubiquinone binding site. Okay, another one only really used in, you don't see this very often in the fungicide world, but we do see it in seed treatment. It's fludeoxonil. And so you can see all of the different products fludeoxonil in. It's a broad spectrum fungicide, no systemic, which is non-systemic with a long residual activity. So it actually stays in the roots. And it basically prevents the phosphorylation of glucose, which basically means that you're shutting down the ability of that fungus to replicate and to actually shutting down the ability of that fungus to feed itself. Okay, other ones in this category, we got Epconazole. So that one is a triazole. You can see a couple of the different categories this one's in. A new one, ethoboxam, very, very good on Pythium control. And we're starting to see this in some seed treatments on the soybean sides. However, Methanoxin still works really well for Pythium control. However, in the corn side now, we're starting to see ethoboxam. So if you think of our new Fortivent Plus on corn seed treatment, that actually has ethoboxam in it, which helps against some of the Pythium problems that we've had in corn. And in Iowa, guys, in these heavier soils, Pythium has been an issue in cool, wet soils. And so definitely this ethoboxam has helped clean some of those up. Okay, where it works, it basically prevents, this is the one that prevents the fungus from replicating. So it shuts down this mitosis and prevents that fungus from replicating. Okay, another new one, and I'm not even going to attempt to say this active ingredient, but the active ingredient in Lumicina, very, very good on Phytophthora. Probably one of the best active ingredients on Phytophthora on the market. And you can see some of the, I'm not even going to try playing this video, but these are treated with Phytophthora, and you'll just have to trust me or watch the video at a later time here. That non-treated soybeans in this inoculated Phytophthora trial, most of these end up dying by the end, whereas this Lumicina works really, really well. Okay, and here's just some trials. This is a Corteva product, and so you can see some of the effects that this Lumicina has. Very effective against Phytophthora in particular. Now, they tested against metalaxyl. I'm going to tell you that Methanoxin is going to look better than what this metalaxyl is, but Lumicina is very, very good on Phytophthora. And this is, Lumicina is the active ingredient that they currently use in Pioneer Premium seed treatment to control Phytophthora. It's very good at that. So you can just see some more effects with that. We actually do have a product in our lineup called Defendus that actually has this product in there as well. Okay, other options, you got group 11s. So azoxystrobins, very common, picoxystrobin and pralaxystrobin. Really, guys, the strobilurins work okay in seed treatment. In fact, some of them are very, very good, especially azoxystrobin work really good, especially if you're looking at picking up some of the Pythium or some of those issues that we might see out in the field. But outside of that, it is more of a broad spectrum. The azoxystrobin, the advantage that one has is it does move, whereas these other two don't. Picoxystrobin works pretty good in the Pioneer Premium seed treatment. I'm not going to say it's bad, but I'm going to say some of those other active ingredients help out a little bit more. Okay, some other new ones, Relania coming out as a new triazole. Okay, some of you guys might be familiar with that one. We also have a new one called Vientis. Okay, this one's from Syngenta, and I've been very impressed with this one this year. We've seen that this Vientis added to Warden CX has picked up quite a bit on Pythium. This one is one of the most active ingredients on Pythium that we have on the market today, or will have. Okay, so Lumicina is very good on Phytophthora. This one's very good on Pythium. And you're starting to see more of this where these active ingredients are very narrow spectrum. They may not even, for example, oomycetes, you got Phytophthora and Pythium in the same chemical or same classification, but like Lumicina is not that great on Pythium, and Vientis isn't that great on Phytophthora. And so there's they're getting a little bit more specialized on which diseases they're attempting to go after. Okay. In our crop protection guide, you will find all of the various ratings for each one of these diseases and all of these. I'm assuming they will update this in the new crop protection guide with a lot of the new products that are coming out. If you guys have any other questions about that, feel free to stick around here. Otherwise, I am going to go ahead and stop the recording.